This is Living Healthy with Your Health Potential, where we explore your options for better health. Brought to you in association with The Woman in You.
Hi, welcome to Living Healthy. I'm your host, Cheryl Worthington Turgeon. The age-old question, is there life after death, has been pondered by the world's greatest minds. Our guest today just may have the answer. Renowned neurosurgeon Eben Alexander thought he knew through science how the brain and consciousness worked. Then he had a near-death experience. After spending nearly a week in a deep coma, a profound change occurred. He has spent the last 2.5 years reconciling his experience with research on quantum physics and cosmology, after documenting his journey in the best-selling book entitled Proof of Heaven. We caught up with Dr. Alexander when he was speaking at the Marian Institute in Marion, Massachusetts. What follows is a glimpse of what he learned. Would you briefly describe your illness and why your medical background is significant?
Well, I'd spent more than 20 years in neurosurgery, 15 years at Harvard Medical School. Thought I had a pretty good idea of how the brain creates consciousness and, mind and soul and spirit and all that kind of thing works. But of course, the problem is that with that kind of very traditional training and understanding, I thought the brain does create consciousness, and that when the brain dies and the body dies, that's the end. And of course, my coma showed me that that is not true at all. And that was a real gift from it. And it's very important to point out that if I'd been in coma or had a near-death experience from any other cause, we wouldn't be here. There'd be no book at all. It had to be a very severe bacterial meningitis. And the reason is that's the most perfect model for human death. And meningitis attacks the neocortex, the outer surface of the brain, and every moment of our conscious memories and awareness and experience since before we were born required processing by that advanced calculator of the neocortex. So by having meningitis that was so severe, it sent me into coma within 3 hours. And I was in coma for 7 days on a ventilator, not expected to live, with no sign of neocortical function beyond the first few hours. There was no place for any experience to happen. And yet when I came back, in spite of having all of my memories of my life before coma deleted by this severe meningitis, it should have killed me. To this day, my doctors have no explanation for how I recovered. But in fact, what I remembered when I first came around was this incredible odyssey from deep within coma that I report in the book, and that is very extensive and prolonged and goes beyond any kind of medical explanation. There's no way it was a hallucination or a dream or confabulation, because it was too real to be real, very extensive, far beyond what my brain could put together even now, much more real than this realm. And the reason is it really happened. But it didn't happen in my brain, and it didn't happen in the physical universe. And it basically is the exception that proves the rule and validates so many other similar experiences as truly occurring. Not just near-death experiences, but experiences going back in the afterlife literature and into the writings of religious mystics and prophets going back 3,000 years, about a very real realm.
Mm-hmm. So that when you looked at this scientifically, and I know you mentioned this in your book, every possible scientific explanation you could rule out because of where your brain was affected.
Right. I was my own worst skeptic for a long time, and luckily my older son, Eben IV, who was majoring in neuroscience at the time in college, he was very skeptical, and he helped me to really dig hard for answers. As I mentioned, when I first came back from my coma, for one thing, it was a very stormy up and down course for several days after I woke up that involved a kind of a paranoid delusional nightmare that I briefly referred to in my book that was actually very instructive. And it was more real than most dreams, but it was nowhere near the ultra reality of the experience deep in coma that was completely beyond any kind of language, pure conceptual flow, the reality of it in a way that is beyond our ability to describe. Because in that realm, one does not see with the eyes or hear with the ears. Often you become major parts of the scene as part of lessons that were there to learn and bring back. By contrast, that kind of delusional 36-hour nightmare after I came out of coma, for one thing, was full of language because my brain was trying to come back online. The other thing that's fascinating about comparing those two, that is the deep coma experience I describe in the book of the gateway realm, the beautiful idyllic valley that had some Earth-like features, and the core outside of all of higher dimensional space and time. The reality of that, those memories have stayed with me as if they happened yesterday. Whereas the memories from that psychotic nightmare that had a lot of language was after I came out of coma, when I was in and out of being present there in the ICU room talking with people, but then they'd see that I was having these very difficult challenges to my notions of reality, very paranoid and delusional. Those memories faded within weeks. And initially, my doctors were shocked and they said, well, you can't have had any experience. Your brain was socked in from the first few hours of my onset of symptoms. And there's no way that I could have any rich experience or remember it. And in fact, in the book, I describe the earthworm's eye view, that very coarse, simple, unresponsive realm where I started, which was like being in deep in underground with roots around me or blood vessels, kind of like being in dirty jello. I call it the earthworm's eye view. And I think that was the best consciousness that my brain could muster when it was soaking in pus, when the whole neocortex had been heavily damaged by this infection that by all rights should have killed me. My doctors have no idea how it didn't, and certainly no idea how I had any experience. But it's very, very clear to all of us, and I went through this with many of my colleagues, trying to explain how my odyssey could happen in my brain, because I thought it had to be brain-based. The words I used with my older son when he came home 2 days after I got out of the hospital, I said it was way too real to be real, which kind of puts it in perspective. It seemed much more real than being in this world. And I thought, based on the clues my doctors had given me, well, you were essentially dead. We have no idea how you had any experience. We have no idea how you've come back. But they told me the dying brain can do all kinds of tricks so you can forget about all that. And that's what I thought. Okay, so I'm supposed to forget it, but it changes your life. I mean, it's so powerful. But I thought, you know, with those early stages, I didn't remember all that I'd known of brain, mind, neuroscience, and consciousness. That all came back in a layered fashion over 6 weeks. And in that early phase of those 6 weeks, I was very busy writing down everything I could remember about my experience. And my son, majoring in neuroscience, Eben IV, he had been the one who advised me, if you want this to be of value to anybody, don't read anything about near-death experiences until you've written down everything you can remember. And of course, that was the worst thing he could say to me because I wanted to read everything, but it was the best thing he could say to me because I wrote everything down, took about 6 weeks, wrote 20,000 words of all that I remembered from deep in coma, which was all there at the beginning. You know, as I was coming around, I knew the whole odyssey that I'd been on, you know, and at a point initially where I didn't even remember any of my life before. And so as that came back, all those memories, especially of consciousness, mind, and brain, there was this incredible conflict. And towards the end of those 6 weeks, I started going back to the hospital, talking with a neurologist, with neurosurgeons who had examined me when I was deep in coma on the ventilator with no sign of cortical response, my brainstem badly damaged, even on the first day, trying to understand how did this happen in the brain. And I mentioned the 9 hypotheses that were kind of the main hypotheses. There were others that we mused over, but those were the main things, trying to explain how this could happen in the brain, especially that ultra reality. And in essence, we could not determine any way that it happened in my brain. It clearly, because there were signs in the coma experience that showed that the vast majority of that odyssey happened before the 5th day and not later on. It was especially the appearance of the 6 faces that I mentioned towards the end of it that pointed out that most of that odyssey and coma happened before the 5th day. And that's when my exams and my scans showed my brain was very badly damaged. The cortex was completely shut down, under attack. In many places around my brain, the deepest levels of the cortex, where it is overlying the white matter, you could see on the scans that it was damaged all the way through to that level. And I was losing that boundary. And so there was no way that it happened in my brain at all. Not a hallucination, not a dream. And it really happened outside of this universe. And then, of course, I started reading the near-death literature and was absolutely blown away, because I realized tens of thousands of people have reported being in that same realm. Yeah. And a place where the skeptics get lost, banging their head into the trees and completely missing the forest, is they get hung up on the details. And they forget that we're stuck with earthly language. And also, when we come back to this incarnation, we're coming back into a brain and a human mind that has a cultural and a personal history. And so, of course, you know, a Christian can see a beautiful, all-loving light being as Christ. And a Muslim might report a beautiful, all-loving light being as Muhammad. And an atheist might report this beautiful, all-loving light being as something they don't know how to name, but it's the most beautiful, powerful, loving force they've ever seen. But they're seeing the same thing. And in fact, for me, the most shocking was not just reviewing the near-death literature and seeing all the similarities, but also going back deeply into afterlife literature, going back thousands of years, the writings of religious mystics and prophets, and seeing that this is all reporting about the same realm that is more real than this one, that is the home of our souls in this eternal existence, where our souls at the deepest levels are one, and one with the divine.
And what would you say, maybe that is the most significant concept you received from your experience, but if you were to name maybe just 3, what would they be?
Well, I think the parts that I most want to make sure that souls remember, because this is really just about reminding souls of something souls know, all of our souls. That is that we are deeply loved by an infinitely loving Creator, unconditional in the love that that Creator has for us, and that we're simply here to serve as conduits for that love, to pass that love out to this world and show compassion and forgiveness, know that we are loved and that we are free to give out that infinite love. It has tremendous healing power in every sense of the word. And by healing, I would say that just by being incarnate in this material physical realm, we're in the process of healing. So it doesn't necessitate being, ill. And as a healer, I now have a much grander view of what's involved with hardship and difficulties, disease or injury, that these are all opportunities for growth, and that we're here to learn lessons, that our souls come back in many incarnations working together with our soulmates, and that connectedness over many lifetimes in ascending in that higher level of our soul between lives towards that oneness with God and the divine explains so much more about the purpose for our existence. And of course, for me, the proof in this had everything to do with having severe bacterial meningitis, realizing that that world is absolutely real, more real than this one. In some ways, I look at it as Plato's world of forms in the allegory of the cave. It's kind of that perfect realm of the eternal dwelling place of our souls and of our oneness with that divine. And just knowing that gives so much more purpose to life, to realize there's nothing to fear. That old saying, nothing to fear but fear itself is much more true than I ever knew. And the fear is what breeds any of the badness in this realm and in those higher realms. Because in essence, that infinite power of love trumps everything else, overwhelms everything else, and shows us that we can exist in this realm and that realm with absolutely no fear, knowing that we're deeply loved and serving as the vehicles for bringing that love into this imperfect realm.
That's beautiful. And you talk about consciousness and really having a new perspective on it from your experience. I'd like to hear more about that.
Well, I think consciousness is really at the key of my understanding of this, and it's something I try and convey to the audience, is in my book, I try and steer it to a place where the discussion is really around some of the deepest, most challenging questions known to all of human thinking. In the scientific realm, I would say the hard problem of consciousness is right at the core. And I would say many who are aware of these kind of things about consciousness, brain, mind, the nature of existence, would say that the hard problem of consciousness is the most challenging and arguably the most unanswerable question in all of human thinking. And it's very simple to put into words. The hard problem simply states that there's no one out there who studies brain and mind and consciousness who can give you the first sentence to explain how the physical brain gives rise to consciousness. And in fact, in the middle of the 20th century, when everybody was heavily hooked into the successes of materialistic science and technology, the psychologists, especially behaviorists and functionalists, would have told you there's no such thing as consciousness. They would have said that all of the workings of our brain and mind, they would have put in quotes, are simply, the natural dance of electrons, protons, photons, neutrons, the atoms, molecules of our brains, and that it's all going by natural laws, and any notion that we have a selfhood or an awareness of self is a complete illusion. They would have told you nobody's conscious. At its extreme, they would have told you no one has free will at all, that we're simply automatons, going by the natural laws of those atoms and molecules and subatomic particles in the cells of our brain, fooling us into thinking we're conscious. And in fact, it turns out that in that heyday of scientific materialism, which was all really initiated by Einstein in 1905 with his 3 miraculous papers, but one of them, for which he won the Nobel Prize, was on the photoelectron effect. And that's what started the quantum revolution, and quantum mechanics originated from that. And of course, the seeds for taking apart that very simplistic scientific materialism are right there in the mysteries of quantum mechanics. And many of the very brilliant founding fathers of quantum mechanics, like Niels Bohr, Erwin Schrödinger, Sir James Jeans, Paul Dirac, Werner Heisenberg, were driven into mysticism because the results of their experiments suggested very strongly that consciousness is crucial in unfolding reality. It's at the very core of reality around us. And not just as an observer, but that the observer is part of the observed. And that is a crucial thing to understand. And of course, we've had almost a century now for physicists to try to come to grips with that and to answer some of those deepest questions about interpreting what quantum mechanics is telling us. And I would say they haven't really done a very good job of it because consciousness really is a far deeper mystery. And contrary to the view of those behaviorists and functionalists, and kind of the view I subscribed to until my coma, of saying, well, consciousness is the epiphenomenon, it's the brain and physical reality, that's reality. I would now say that that's completely backwards. And the thing we know exists is our consciousness. Soul, spirit. My journey is proved very clearly that soul and spirit are much grander than consciousness kind of dumbed down on this side of the veil. And that in fact, when our body and brain die, our conscious awareness is liberated back to a much higher level, which is what I glimpsed during my near-death experience. Many other near-death experiencers report the same thing. More than half of them report that ultra-reality that is impossible to put into words, that realm where they're encountering souls of departed loved ones, often when they don't even know that particular soul has passed over, but they find out later, yes, they had. And it's that we can also reach that realm, not just through near-death or death experience, but through centering prayer, deep meditation, the gift of desperation, all the many ways that we come into spiritually transformative experiences can help to change our lives and open our knowing to the reality of eternity of our souls, that our souls are connected with our loved ones and with our soul mates. When I say soulmate, that's not necessarily the loved one. That can be the spouse with whom one had a bitter divorce, but you're both there to teach each other difficult lessons. I came to realize that some of the those in my life from before coma, who I might have even seen as my enemy, my nemesis, were in fact very dear soulmates, and that we were here to teach each other very tough and challenging lessons. And it's that kind of realization now that in fact, as the materialists, the scientific materialists are in a big rush studying string theory, quantum gravity, the very fundamental nature of space and time, to tell us that in fact there's no material to the material world. It goes back to a quote 50 years ago from Sir James Jeans, one of my favorites, that the universe begins to look much more like a great thought than a great machine. And it is a thought. It is the thought of our consciousness as one, and of course at its core, the divine of God, with whom we are all one through that divine spark of our very conscious awareness. And this is just a reminder to souls that that's the case, that we're all deeply loved forever, and that we are all one.
That is, it's profound and it's beautiful. And it inside, it's right.
I think we souls do feel this and know this. And to me, I think the greatest value of this kind of thinking is it is very much consistent with some of the deepest thinking in humanity over thousands of years. And I've come to realize that the heyday of scientific materialism and the successes of science and technology in the 20th century were very necessary. And I consider myself more of a scientist now than I've ever been. But I realize I must greatly expand the boundaries of science to fully embrace the deep mystery of consciousness and the fact that our soul, spirit, consciousness is one, is not created by the brain at all. Mm-hmm. In fact, I would say the brain serves as a reducing valve or a filter that kind of dumbs down consciousness, because the consciousness pre-exists all and exists outside of all of this material universe, and in fact is the basis for it all. And it makes so much more sense to see it that way. The examples I give for the clinical neuroscientists out there who are saying, what do you mean the brain doesn't create consciousness? I would point out terminal lucidity, which I mentioned in my book, of how often demented elderly patients, before they pass over, have these oases of brilliant kind of thinking that shows their mind is very intact. And often at the time when they're seeing those souls of departed loved ones who are there to escort them back over. And I have one example of that in my book that was told to me by a good friend who's the head of a neuroscience department, neurosurgical department, one of the top academic neuroscientists on earth, who was with his own father about a year before our discussion, when he saw this and he knew it was real, and he saw basically the soul of his own grandmother, the mother of the father, who was there to escort the soul of the father back over. And he didn't know what to make of it until I told him my story, and then he saw, of course, it all makes such perfect sense. So terminal lucidity, and also cases of acquired savant or idiot savant syndromes, where people have some kind of brain damage. Often it's in the form of autism or a stroke or a head injury, and then they emerge from that with some superhuman mental capacity, like to remember a phone book, you know, 1 page per second. They go through it and they remember every name, every number. I had a patient who was able, after a head injury, to look at a map. He could look at a map for a second, and then he could draw the entire map in great detail just from that one visual memory. Musical abilities. I mean, these acquired savant syndromes are fascinating, and there's absolutely no explanation whatsoever in our conventional neuroscientific model of brain makes mind that explains them at all. And so the brain serves as a filter, reducing valve. And that's what I saw, because as my neocortex was taken apart by severe bacterial meningitis, and I was down at the depths of that earthworm eye view, my previous thinking would say, well, the next step is nothingness. But in fact, the next step was the blinders coming off and coming up into this beautiful, idyllic, ultra-real valley, crisply real and vivid and alive beyond anything described on Earth. And to try and explain how that happened, there was really only one way.
And you know, I think the best way for people to understand that experience would be to read your book.
Well, I think reading the book helps. I would also recommend people go to my website, lifebeyonddeath.net, and in addition visit Eternia, eternea.org, which is listed at the end of my book. Eternia.org is a site we started to educate people about how science and spirituality are coming together, the physics of consciousness. It also has a database where people can tell their own stories of their own spiritually transformative experiences, and we have experts in all these different modalities who can help to analyze those and bring those together.
And Dr. Alexander, we're out of time, but I have just so enjoyed talking with you, and it's so enlightening. For more information on Dr. Alexander, you can visit his website at lifebeyonddeath.net. For more information on the Marian Institute, you can visit them on the web at marianinstitute.org. Thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Cheryl Worthington Turgeon. See you next time on Living Healthy.